Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I am going to be doing a spoiler-filled review of Empire of the Vampire. Now it's not going to be a typical review where I'm necessarily going to be like critiquing it every single second, but I wanted to go through my notes that I made on my iPad, and then I also tabbed the book quite a bit as well. I don't typically make notes on my iPad unless I'm reading it on my iPad or I'm reading it as a Kindle edition, but I actually bought the hardback, I pre-ordered it, months ago. And I thought, you know what, I'm actually gonna make notes as I go through this because I really want to film like a spoiler-filled video. Just going through the book and talking about my reactions. It's gonna be pretty chill. I've got my cup of herbal tea and we're just going to go through it. So let's buckle in. Oh, maybe one thing to mention is that if you haven't read the book, definitely go check out my non-spoiler review. It's where I just talk high level about my initial thoughts. This is obviously going to be spoiler filled, so if you haven't read the book or you don't care about spoilers, then obviously continue watching. But if you do care, then come back to this once you have read the book. I will give a very quick summary for those who haven't necessarily watched that video. I was very lukewarm on this book. I absolutely loved book one. It's a favourite of fantasy book of mine. It captured my imagination in a way that I didn't anticipate, especially because I'd heard very mixed things about Kristoff's writing in the previous series and books that he's written. So I was very kind of apprehensive when I first started reading it, but I fell in love with the world. I fell in love with the characters. I typically don't read vampire, supernatural, fantasy at all, but it just works in this series. It really does work. But then I read Empire of the Damned and I read it in about 5 days, which is pretty quick considering I was really busy at work and this book is pretty damn chunky. But I had issues with it. I did have quite a few issues with it. I gave it like a 2.75, 3 stars, and I gave it that because a lot of it felt very drawn out. I didn't really feel like it had a point. I don't think we've really learned anything new. And look, I'm all for following a character-driven story that doesn't really have a direction, but it still needs to have a direction, And this book didn't really feel like that. That being said, I did love the writing. I did love the characters. I loved being back with Gabe, and I did really enjoy the world that he's built. It's just that the plot and the direction in which it's going is something that I'm a little bit apprehensive about. So anyway, we're going to go through my notes. I took a bunch of notes. I literally, after every chapter, I would write a few sentences of what I was thinking about. So I'm basically just going to take you through that. It's not necessarily going to be like a critique, but I'm just going to talk through my thoughts chapter by chapter, book by book, because this book is split into 5 books. And let's just kind of see where it goes. Buckle in. I have no idea how long this video is going to be. Just buckle in and enjoy, I guess. All right. So first chapter. So the first chapter begins with Jean-Francois. Jean-Francois is essentially one of the characters in the first book we are introduced to, who is writing Gabe's story for his queen. And he's I think he's enthralled to the queen, and he has been tasked by her to write Gabe's entire story because Gabe has obviously been with the Redeemer, essentially, which is Dior. And Jean-Francois, I quite like him as a character. I do find him a little bit one-dimensional sometimes, but I did find it very, what I suspect is typical of Kristoff, to start the first chapter with an orgy. I wasn't expecting it, I'll be honest. And I've heard, very mixed things about his previous books, and there's a lot of weird sex in it and over-sexualization of women, which I talked about in my review of the first book. But I don't know, it's just so unnecessary, I think a lot of times authors use sex as a way to be edgy, and it just doesn't need to be the case, it really doesn't. And I just thought it was super unnecessary. It didn't really add anything to the story overall, and it just felt like it was there for the fun of it, which I guess fair enough. I mean, if you're the author and you like that stuff and you want to put it into your book, fine. But as a book reviewer and as a consumer of the book, as a reader of the book, I just don't think it's necessary. Then we get on to chapter 2 and we get Jean-Francois going to the Queen because she's commanded him to go there. I really like the art in these books. We get a lot of really beautiful art in these books.
that I don't know who it's done by, but whoever's done it is very talented. And I really liked the way that the Queen, Margot, was shown to be rendered in the painting versus how she actually is in real life. Like in the painting, she's shown to be like very smooth face, very young, but in real life she's quite old. She's got wrinkles and stuff like that. And I've always found that concept of how kings and queens would present themselves in one way in paint, but then they would look very different in real life. So I really like that painting and seeing it. And then chapter 3, I wrote, there's some cringe dialogue, page 18. Ooh, let's have a look what I wrote. What's the cringe dialogue on page 18? Like, I actually referenced, like, different things I was tagging. Oh, yeah, this is it. Gabe is pretty cheesy sometimes. I mentioned this in my non-spoiler review. He says, if you're going to try to fuck me, vampire, at least have the decency to buy me a drink first. I mean, come on, mate. It's pretty cheesy. All right, and then that's kind of like the prologue. We get the reintroduction to Jean-Francois and to Gabe, to Queen Margot. We meet her as well, and then we go off to book 1. Chapter 1, I wrote, yay, Ash Drinker. I really like a sentient weapon. I don't know why. It's just something that I find really fun. I wrote here that I love the relationship between Gabe and Dior. They've really got this father-daughter relationship, and it reminds me of the Ellie-Joel relationship in The Last of Us, which is one of my favourite tropes, and I think it's done so well in this book, and I really feel for the two of them when they're not together, and you can really feel the concern that they have for each other. Super satisfying to read, and I'm really curious to see where it goes next, especially after that ending. We then get introduced to Selene in chapter 2, Gabe's sister, who was killed when she was younger, and I wrote, she's going to play a critical role, and she does play a critical role in this book. And the fact that Gabe tastes her blood is obviously very concerning, because when you taste one of a vampire's blood, you essentially become enthralled to them, and over time they will be able to control you essentially. So I'm very kind of curious to see how that plays out in book 3, because it's referenced quite a few times in this book as we progress. In chapter 3, I said I like Selene. She gives me the creeps, and I like the training scenes. I do love a good training scene. It's really satisfying. I did write, hope we don't spend tons of time traveling again, which unfortunately we do, and that's one of my critiques that I said in my non-spoiler review. It's just a lot of aimless wandering, in my opinion, that, you know, kind of felt a bit pointless, but I'll come onto that more later, I'm sure. I skipped chapter 4, went straight to chapter 5, and I said that I really like Lachlan. I did really like Lachlan, and I wrote, I hope he doesn't die. I like his banter with Gabe. I like seeing someone from Gabe's past, seeing him as he was back in the day, as this kind of legend, as this hero, but we see Gabe as somebody who's kind of done with that life, and it's really, really interesting and satisfying to read that contrast. I wrote, I have a feeling that Lachlan and Dior will get together. Boy, was I wrong. I mean, they definitely flirt a little bit. Well, mainly Lachlan flirting with Dior, but they definitely didn't get together. And then I also wrote here that I hope Aaron and Baptiste are alive, who were banished from the order due to being gay. And I thought that was quite an interesting thread to talk about in book 1. And we do get a tiny bit more exploration of that in this book. And I was really glad to find that they are both alive, but unfortunately they're kind of like shadows of themselves, which we see later on in the book, which was really sad. Then I go on to chapter 6, and I wrote that I love that we truly get a sense of how much Gabe loves Dior, especially like a daughter. It feels very real, and I do agree with that. I do think it feels extremely real, and you could see that relationship existing in real life. It's very, very touching. All right, I'm going to take a sip. This book is very dark. I think the first book is also quite dark, but there's some scenes in this book, like in chapter 6, where there are children in cages, and it's just very grim, especially when I've literally seen images of that recently with what's happening in Palestine. So it's very jarring to read about it and then actually get like the image of actual children who are going through that right now. Like, it just added an extra layer of grimness, because when it's like literally happening today. But I do really like seeing how like the consequences of Dior's and particularly Gabe's actions are playing out. Like, we're really seeing what happened at the end of book 1 come to a head in this book, because there's a lot of people who are very much against what Gabe did, which is that he didn't sacrifice Dior so that the son could come back. And to be honest, I probably would have done the same thing that he did, especially if you loved her like a daughter. But it's interesting to see now the cost of that, right? The cost of making that decision. Then I wrote, Dior, why can't she stay away? I love that she wants to rescue the children, but come on. It's true. I mean, I love a good, flawed hero. I think it's very much in Dior's character to do what she did, which is she sees obviously a bunch of children in a cage that are being held captive by Chiara, and Chiara is the daughter of one of the like chief vampires. I'll come into her more later. But I really like the fact that Dior is very pure in her intent, and she's just such a lovely person. Like, she's just so pure. I also wrote that I do really like the way he writes battle scenes, and I do think Kristoff is very talented at writing battle scenes. They feel very visceral, they feel very alive. You could definitely see them being in a movie or a TV show. I'm here for it. Then we move on to this concept of sanguimancy. I definitely said that wrong, which is like the power to be able to control blood, I think. And Selene has that power, and it's so cool. Like, it's the coolest power ever. Like, it's fucking weird, but it's really cool to read. And she exhibits that power with the, I think they're called the Divok. I could be wrong, but I think it's the Divok. I just hope we get more exploration of that at some point in the future. Then we get on to chapter 8, and we get Phoebe. Phoebe is a woman. Phoebe is alive. I mean, that was my first reaction. I was like, Phoebe's alive, and then Phoebe is a person? Like, she's not just a lion. Phoebe the lion was like one of my faves, and I was so sad that she was dead. But she's not dead. She was like very, very near death. But apparently when you're like very, very near death, you could, like, they can come back to life or something, into their human form. And I was so happy that she was alive. I do find it really funny that, of course she was naked, but then I thought about it and I was like, well, she wouldn't have clothes on, would she? Because she's a lion. Like, that would be so weird. I really like the fact that Phoebe becomes a part of the crew. I love her character. I think she's great, and you need somebody like her to lighten up the mood. Then we go on to a few chapters later, and I hope we don't get constant traveling. I want these guys to settle in one place for a bit. Yeah, I didn't get that, unfortunately. That was kind of annoying. I do find it quite funny that the way Lachlan realised that Dior is a woman, because at this point she's still dressing like a boy, because she's on her period, and he can obviously smell the blood. He's a smart guy, I'm not gonna lie. Then we move on to book 2, and we get introduced, I think we get reintroduced to Albert and Elaine Voss, and they are Fabian, the Forever King's like minions, like his children, I think, basically. And they actually genuinely sound quite terrifying. There's lots of tension in the first chapter of book 2 that I thought was done really, really well. And the realization that Gabe and Dior have failed through no fault of their own doing is a really stark realization, as both for them and then also for the reader. Then we go on to chapter 2. I said that I really like the light-hearted moments with the clothes in the wardrobe when they go into this like castle, basically. And I thought it was just a nice way to introduce light relief. I've always said I like the quiet moments between characters, and we definitely get that in the scene. But then I write, don't like that all this seems to be pointless. Even the characters are frustrated, lol. Yeah, I mean, that whole scene in the castle, which kind of acts, I guess, as the inciting incident for the events that are to come, kind of just felt like a bit ridiculous, to be completely honest. I think it could have been written differently. Again, I'm not a writer or an author, so I don't know, but it felt like it dragged on a little bit too long at the very least. Then we go on to chapter 3, and we realise and we learn that we don't know why Fabian still wants Dior. We don't know why he's chasing after her. The characters don't know either. And we still haven't got that reveal. So I'm very curious as to when we will find that out. And then I write in chapter 4, oh dear, Gabe and Dior's relationship is fracturing. And we do get that hint very early on. It's not completely fractured even by the end of the book, but there is definitely trouble starting, which I always like to see. Again, it reminds me of The Last of Us between Ellie and Joel, where they start to have very differing opinions, and it starts to take a toll on their relationship. I really like the chess analogy. I thought it was really cool, and I suspect it will come back again in the future. I mean, it does come back later on in this book too, but I'm sure it will come back again in the future. What is it with chess and fantasy books?
It's interesting. Then I write chapter 5. Yep, I was right. The chess strategy came in handy. And then I write can't believe Gabe hit Dior, which we find out later on was Selene's fault. She was able to basically manipulate Gabe's blood or something so that he would feel much more like angry, so that by the time him and Gabe talk, he's already like not in a great state. And when she says something he disagrees with, he hits her. And it's very sad to find out that it wasn't even Gabe's fault. I mean, he still did it, obviously, he still should accept responsibility, but I do find it quite sad that Dior never actually got to find out that he didn't do it after, before she died. That was really sad. And then I wrote very slowly warming up to Selene. That cools down later on. And I wrote, shit, Kiara is back. Then we go on to chapter 6, and I wrote in caps lock, oh my god, Phoebe died, ? And Selene let go of Gabe's hand, ? Ah! So you can, I was literally writing these notes as I was reading the book, so you can see my live reactions. And I was not surprised that Selene let go. I knew she was going to do it, given their very fractured relationship, and given that she has a very specific purpose for Dior, which they don't agree on. So I did see that coming, but it was always a nice twist to witness. And then I wrote at the end, now we're going to get Selene's POV, I'm intrigued. And to be honest with you, I did not like Selene's POV. I don't think she's interesting enough. She's interesting, but she's not interesting enough as a character to justify an entire POV, which we get 2 or 3 times in this book. Gabe, for me, is the star of the show, of this series. And I really hope we don't get multi-POV later on, or especially at least not of Selene, because I just don't find her interesting enough. But anyway, let's move on to book 3. So chapter 1, interesting to read Selene's version of her and Gabe's childhood. Loved hearing about her relationship with her dad, which was really interesting, which Gabe's relationship with his dad was very different. And interesting to hear why she did what she did with Gabe. I wrote, we're an enemy in someone else's story. They had a lot of issues when they were growing up, and it was really satisfying to hear that from her perspective in addition to Gabe's perspective. Then we see Dior, and she saved Joaquin, and I wrote, will he eventually save her later? And he does. I really like the character of Joaquin, and I really like the reveal of Joaquin later on in the book, which I'll talk about later. And then number 4, then I wrote poor Isla. Isla is one of the children that is rescued earlier on in the book. And I was so happy in this chapter 4, that Baptiste is also alive, but that also Aaron is not. He's like a vampire that's enthralled now. And so he is not in a good state. He's not a Silver Saint anymore, basically, which is really tragic. And then on chapter 5, I wrote, I've realised how much I miss Gabe. He really is the star of the show, and I want him back. That just says it all, really. The descriptions of the Court of Blood in chapter 6 were really cool. I think it presents a very grim stage for the subsequent chapters to be kind of based in that, and I just thought it was really cool. Yeah, I really liked it. And then I wrote, no, you drank Lilith's blood. And as I said earlier, and if you've read this book, you'll know that when you drink a vampire's blood, you get enthralled to them. But I also wrote, this is not going to affect her, because it's Dior, she can heal, right? And her blood has like magic in it. So I had a very strong feeling that it wasn't going to impact her, which is exactly what happens later on in the book. I do think there are some very predictable aspects to this book. That doesn't make it necessarily any less enjoyable, but it does take away some of the twists and turns that that sometimes I like. And then I wrote, Selene is there as a moat. This is chapter 8 now, actually quite useful. She's able to see what's going on with Dior without actually physically being there. I feel really bad for Aaron being treated so badly. And we're now in a prison setting, and I was very curious to see how they were going to get out. Then we're on to chapter 9, and I wrote, Nikita is such a creep. The bath scene where Dior is bathing, he comes in and starts washing her hair. Like, that would be generally like a romantic scene, but in this it's just very creepy. I don't think it's meant to be a romantic scene or anything by any means, but it's just very weird, and he kind of creeps me out. He's also the father of Kiara, and she's enthralled to him, so, there's history there as well. And then I wrote that, oh no, she dropped the vial which would allow Gabe to track her. Will he now be on a goose chase? Thankfully not. That doesn't happen. Otherwise I would have been even more annoyed than I was. But
she ends up kind of staying in the same location, so it doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't really, you know, affect the overall story. Then chapter 10, I wrote weird sexy scene with Lilith. Why do these characters always manage to find a way out, getting a bit boring and predictable? That's true. The sexy scene with Lilith is between Dior and Lilith, I remember correctly, and I just, again, like, I don't really get it. She basically finds a way to kind of get out of the situation that she's in. Like I said, would be nice if it was a bit harder for our characters. Chapter 11. Oh no, Aaron is enthralled to Kiara. Another attempt to flee failed, getting repetitive, especially as we know they will eventually get out. So as you can see, my frustrations start to come in quite quickly as I was reading through this book. I found it to be quite repetitive. I found it to be largely quite pointless because we're repeating a lot of the same things that have already happened in the previous book. Some of these tropes I don't mind, but if you keep reusing the same tropes without doing something differently, I'm going to get bored very quickly. And whilst I wasn't super bored, I definitely was getting bored of certain tropes. We move on, and chapter 13, the twins have come to get Dior. So that's Alba and Hélène Voss, Fabian's daughters or whatever. They've come to get Dior, and he's like, I think Fabian's like the most powerful one in this world. He's like the end villain, basically. I was quite curious to see how they would debate with Lilith, and not much really happened to me. One thing that I found really interesting in this chapter is the fact that Voss can enter into dead bodies and use them as like a mouthpiece. Very creepy, and quite liked that as a concept. Then we move on to chapter 14, and oh no, Dior is fully entranced to Lilith, but I know it's fake. I wrote that. There's another weird sexy scene. I wrote Dior is definitely faking it. Everyone wants Gabe, because she writes, I remember in this chapter, Dior is talking about how she wants Gabe back, and then we find out in chapter 15 that we are getting Gabe back, and book 4 switches perspective back to Gabe. Not tons happens in this book, but you know, we're seeing more about Dior and what's going on with her through the eyes of, obviously, through Selene. I wouldn't say much of it is that interesting, if I'm being completely honest. Then we get book 4. There's 6 books, not 5 books. Then we get book 4. So I wrote, yay, Gabe is back. He's horny and hard. Then we get back to the story. I think that's Kristoff's MO now. Then we get to chapter 2, and I really like Gabe and Phoebe's budding friendship. I hope this doesn't turn into a romance, which obviously it does. More on this later. I say in chapter 3, I really like their bickering. It's very enjoyable. I do love a good bickering duo. Then in chapter 4, I write again, oh no, Gabe and Phoebe are going to get romantically involved, or is this just bloodthirst? I think chapter 5, they have like a bit of an argument, and I say that Phoebe didn't deserve that. I think Phoebe gets a lot of shit from Gabe in this book, and she's far too forgiving in my opinion. Like, I know he's been through some shit stuff, but so is she. Like, she lost her husband, never found him, and, you know, she's lost Dior, who she's supposed to be guarding. Like, she's been through a lot of stuff and doesn't deserve it either. Chapter 7, I write, oh man, lots of tension in this scene. Love Gabe's speech about heroes and how they're made for no purpose beyond a means to an end. Yeah, this is the scene where he talks to Lachlan, because Lachlan is talking about how Gabe is like his hero and about how someone he's already respected. And Gabe talks about the fact that he is purely there as a prop, and his heroism is used as a prop to entice other people into the Silver Saints order. And I thought that was really interesting and a really cool kind of small piece of thematic work to explore. Then I write chapter 8. Oh, I really like Phoebe and Gabe. They're good friends, and their shared loss is very touching. Love this vulnerable moment between them as she talks about who she lost. I really love that scene. Then I write chapter 9. Sex scene wasn't the worst, but of course the bad guys come when they're having sexy times, and that's exactly what happens. A bunch of people come. I think Phoebe's even like naked at this point, which I thought was really funny. And yeah, naturally in the next chapter, Phoebe gets hurt. She gets shot. She does survive, and her clan then come in to help her. But my question at that point was, at what cost? Then we get more info on the clan, which are called the Dusk Dancers, which is what Phoebe is. And I think they seem really cool. They remind me of, if anyone's played Horizon Zero Dawn, the way Alo dresses in that game is how I would imagine these women are dressed for some reason. But they seem very cool, and I was very confused as to why Gabe did not realise that the bear he's fighting and the other animals that are following him, like the birds, are not women, given that he knows Phoebe has the ability to shapeshift into a lion. Like, come on, mate, use your brain. You're a smart guy. Like, come on. Then we have chapter 12, where he has to convince the Dust Dancers to help him basically take an army to rescue Dior. And I wrote, oh shit, he's obviously going to be able to convince them, despite the fact that they have a truce with Lilith and the Divok vampires. I really like the court setting that we see in chapter 3, in chapter 13 play out. I like seeing all the different factions at play. It feels epic, yet very intimate. I find it very interesting that naturally few are willing to risk the peace that they have with the Divok, which I think made a lot of sense. But that's obviously undermined by the fact that they then end up helping them. But I do love that in this scene that Gabe gets butterflies when he's with Phoebe. I think it's really nice to see a softer side of him, which we've only ever seen with Dior. And I like it. I do love seeing the kind of bad guy, macho guy have a soft side, I'm not gonna lie. Then we get on to another sex scene. He bites her too much, Phoebe, and then someone runs into the room when they're kind of staring at each other after what he's done. Naturally, that's bad for Phoebe because it means that she will start to feel enthralled to Gabe, and we don't want that. And I find chapter 15 absolutely hilarious because he's fighting that entire scene completely naked. I just think that's so funny. I find it super interesting how much stronger and alert he is after drinking Phoebe's blood. And Phoebe stops the fight. And then we move on to essentially the next book. At this point, the story pauses. Gabe and Jean-Francois have a chat, and he says he's jealous of Gabe because he's loved and felt love, even though he's lost it, but he's with his previous wife and his daughter, but he's at the very least felt it at one point. And even though he's had pain, you know, it's had meaning and it's represented the love that he's had previously. I thought that was a really nice kind of way of putting it. You know, Jean-Francois is immortal. Those who are mortal actually have more meaningful lives in a way because their lives are so short, they have to live them to the fullest, if that makes sense, which I really like. Then we go on to book 5. Chapter 1, have a feeling Dior is faking it, and I was right. Her powers are so cool. She can break the thrall. Can she also break Gabe's thirst and the madness in the future, which I have a feeling she's going to be able to do. I really liked the character of Rain in this book. She's royalty. She's the daughter of Neem Nine Swords, who was a warrior queen back in the day. And I think her story about being the kind of like forgotten child is really interesting and also has parallels to Dior's, which is what kind of connects them together, which I really loved. I love the fact that in chapter 2, Dior is trying to help relieve some of the people by slipping her blood to them so that they can heal and get out of the thrall. It's risky. I did have a worry that someone was going to tell Lilith. I find it very interesting that Dior's blood is doing very weird things, like it's jumping up and about in her hands or something. Very cool. And the tomb as well that Selene has been looking for is obviously very significant as it has the sigil of the Holy Grail, which Dior is the Holy Grail. Then I say in chapter 4, Gabe and Phoebe are here. Dior should be able to help Aaron get back to normal. Weird that Kiara sees Nikita as her father, even though they were ex-lovers. Like, I just think that's such a weird trope to employ. I don't know. That's like some of the weird stuff in these books that I don't like. Thankfully, it's in the minority, but like, just why? Why? Then Selene is going to talk to Gabe, looking forward to seeing them have a reunion. And I love that Dior cares so much about the other people in the Divok castle with Lilith and everything. I love the fact that she has a really caring streak in her. And then Dior gets one day to save more of the enthralled. Selene tells Gabe the plan, and Gabe says, okay, tell her we'll give her a day. And then Dior says to Isla that she and Joaquin will get there happily ever after. I said, I guarantee you that's probably not going to happen. And then there's this really interesting thing that happens at the end of that chapter where they go into the tomb and they come out, but we're never told what they actually see in the tomb. So I'm very curious as to what they actually saw. Then we get the revelation, which I mentioned earlier, that Selene was trying to cause division between Dior and Gabe. That's why he slapped her. I do feel quite sorry for Selene because she never really got to live the life she wanted. She never really got the opportunity to be like the shining child, unlike Gabe. But she did have, you know, a relationship with her own father, whereas because Gabe and Selene have the same mother but different fathers, and there is this mystery around who is Gabe's father as well, which we find out a little bit later on.
Then I say, oh, Dior and Rain are so cute. I like their discussion about their respective mothers, which I talked about earlier on. And I really like the fact that Selene, we get the reveal that Selene actually ended up saving Gabe's life when they were younger. And she did actually meet his father, who went by the name of Wulfric, who was also her teacher. She took blood from him, if I remember correctly, and that's why she is the way that she is, from what I understand. And then chapter 10, I write, man, what a grim chapter, so much blood spilled. Isla betrayed Dior, knew it. That is what happens. I did actually predict that earlier on. And then, damn, everything is falling apart. In chapter 11, we actually get a scene where Gabe prays, which this book is very anti-religion and it's very anti-God. Like the amount of times that we get Gabe's reflections on how much he dislikes God and thinks God doesn't exist. Like it's very much like, it's very anti-God. It is very interesting that the Gabe then prays after everything basically goes to shit. Then we get to book 6. We're coming up to the end. This is the final book. And I really love the Baptiste and Gabe reunion. Again, love the touching moments when all this crazy shit is happening. Phoebe and Gabe are super cute. I really love the fact that Dior continues to show her smarts and she ends up putting her blood in beer, which she then gave to the soldiers, or she didn't give it personally, but it was given to the soldiers so they're no longer in the vampire's thrall. At this point, I should have mentioned this earlier, at this point, Gabe and, you know, the gang are basically trying to storm that castle where Dior is, and Dior is trying to weaken as much as she can before they go and enter it, essentially. Then I say, oh man, poor Baptiste. Gabe gets hit. Lachlan arrives to the rescue. I did write, I'm not a fan of the cavalry comes to the rescue trope. I just, it's a cheap tactic in my opinion, and I would have liked to have seen a bit more suffering. God, I'm horrible. And then I write in chapter 3, the Voss have arrived, and essentially Gabe and Dior and the guys are like kind of stuck in the middle at this point, which is pretty crazy. Chiara dies, and we then get up to chapter 5, where Gabe actually then kills Alba and Hélène. And we get another mention of that Selene drank from Gabe's father. Nikita dies. Baptiste is the one who does the final blow, which I thought was super satisfying. And then I had a question mark around whether Lilith is actually dead, which we end up finding that she isn't, and she's able to kill Dior later on. And then the Gabe and the Dior reunion was so adorable. I just love seeing them back together. It felt very heartfelt, and you can tell that they both really missed each other and that they both really care about each other. Then chapter 6, we're coming up to the end. We meet Connor, which is Phoebe's husband, who, you know, went missing, and he's alive. And we get into this scene where Gabe and Selene start fighting about some really stupid things, which, you know, that I always think to myself, time and place, right? And this was just not the time nor the place to have this fight. And they're just kind of bitching at each other, and it's so pointless. And because of this pettiness between the two of them, Dior gets killed. Lilith comes up behind her, kills Dior. Connor tries to help, kills Connor, and then Lilith dies. I don't know who does like the final blow. I think maybe that's like her last thing she does before she dies. But it was crazy. Like the way she got up behind Dior, and then Connor tried to help, nobody else was around Dior. Like, I just think the way in which it happened was good. Like, I'm glad that Lilith kind of had her last chance to kill Dior. But I don't like the fact that it was because Gabe and Selene were being idiots. Like, they were basically being idiotic brother and sister. Like, I think it was such a silly distraction, in my opinion. Then we get to the final chapter in this book, and my reaction was, what is going to happen now? Like, what is the point? You know, the whole point of this was Dior was going to be the redeemer. She was going to be the one that would bring the sun back to the world. But she's dead now. So what is going to happen? We get to epilogue chapters, Dawn chapter 1. And I thought it was really cool, the reveal that Dario, who is one of Jean-Francois's like servants, is actually Joaquin. I did not see that coming, and I thought that was super satisfying. And I love it when an author can pull the wool over my eyes, and he did that without a doubt. And then Dawn chapter 2, we get the reveal that Dior is actually alive. She's not actually dead. And for me, I don't really like
the resurrection trope. Selene, I think, brings her back to life, if I remember correctly. Well, she comes back to life in some way. She is actually dead, and then she comes back to life. And I don't like that. I don't like it. I really do not like the resurrection trope. I just find it to be quite cheap. I am very curious now about what is going to happen. Like, is Dior going to be the same Dior? Is her magic going to be the same type of magic? Is she immortal now? Like, I don't understand, like, in what capacity has she been brought back to life? Like, is she still just going to be the same Dior and she's just being revived, basically? Or is she being revived by some sort of nefarious magic? What impact that's going to have on her? We don't know. We don't know. I think the ending was really good. It's just that I think the majority of the book went on far too long, and I did not like the dual POV. I don't think Selene is interesting enough as a character. She's an interesting character. She's just not interesting enough as a character to be able to carry like half of the book. I just find that a lot of this book was pointless. A lot of this book didn't need to happen. A lot of this book could have just been cut out. It could have just been a 300-400 page, book to get to the point where Dior gets captured and all that stuff happens and then she gets revived. Or it would have been nice if none of that stuff actually happened and the book had gone in a completely different direction. I feel very lukewarm about this book. There were certain aspects of it that I really liked. Like, I loved a lot of the intimate moments. I loved seeing our characters develop, and I liked some of the world building as well. But I think the overall book made me feel very dissatisfied. I didn't feel like that I really got anything from it, if I'm being completely honest, and that it didn't give me what I consider to be a satisfying next step in this series. I know I'm in the minority though. I know I'm in the minority. I really hate the resurrection trope. I really hate the cavalry has come to save the day trope. I also wasn't initially the biggest fan of, certain characters coupling together, but I have to say he managed to kind of change my mind on that. But there are certain things in this book that I just really didn't like, and I don't think they added anything to the overall series. And I'm not going to lie, I'm very worried about where this series is going to go now. I really hope that it's not just like a headless chicken running around trying to put together some random shit that nobody really cares about. Finally, before I finish off the video, I am just going to read a few quotes. I do find Kristoff's writing to be very, very quotable, and there are a few quotes that I tabbed that I thought I would read. One of the things that I really like about Gabe as a character is that he loves books, and this is a quote that he says. "A life without books is a life not lived, Dior. There's a magic like no other to be found in them. To open a book is to open a door to another place, another time, another mind. And usually, mademoiselle, it's a mind far sharper than your own." He is right. I agree. "The road is black ahead, and it's hard to keep walking when you can't see the ground beneath your feet. But that's what courage is. The will to keep walking in the darkness, to believe the end is just beyond your outstretched hand rather than a million miles away. And while some might falter, some might fail, some might curl up like babes rather than walk on through that lonely night, you are not that girl." Love it. All right. I think this one is a really good quote. So this quote is just before one of the big battles. "It's a strange thing, that silence before the storm. I've stood on the eve of 100 battles, cold blood. I've seen every way a person deals with that fear. Some drink and carouse, desperate to wring one last drop out of life before they dance with death. Some seek solace in another's arms, a moment of living in those warm, soft places where nothing else matters. Nearly everyone prays. People say the test of a man's mettle is on the battlefield. But that's not the truth. You want to know a man? Look into his eyes the night before the shouting and screams drown out the voice inside his head, before he gets drunk enough to think himself brave, when it's just him and the things he's done and the things he might never do. That's when you'll see us as we truly are." I think I might just do two short ones. "Cruelty is an infection spread from one victim to the next, an avalanche rolling ever downhill and crashing worst upon those at the bottom of the pile." So true. This is a nice quote. "I'd rather die for something that matters than live for nothing at all. And because a man survived long enough to have a grey beard and wrinkles means not that he's actually lived. To live is to risk, to fear, and to fail. A man must dance on the dragon's teeth to steal the fire from its tongue. Most are burned alive in the attempt.
but better to dance and fall than to never have danced at all. Pity not the man who dies too soon, but the one who lingers too long. For those men who pass peaceful in their beds, who slip one night soft into sleep and wake nevermore, can they be said to have been awake at all? So I did give this book 2.75, like a 3 stars out of 5. I gave the first book like a 4.55/5 out of 5 stars. I love that book so much. This book for me was a massive letdown. Like, I did really love being back in the world, and I do love Gabe as a character, and I'm sure I always will love Gabe as a character. I did like the introduction of some other characters like Phoebe. I do continue to really like Dior. I think the enemies are quite well realised as well. But it just left me feeling very dissatisfied because it just felt like a filler book where nothing really happened, and I felt like I genuinely wasted quite a lot of time reading this book, which is quite sad to say, to be honest. So there we have it. Let me know down below if you have read this book. Let me know if there were any points that really kind of stuck out for you. Let me know if you also like this style of video. It's not really a review. It's more just like my notes as I was reading the book, and then my reflections now that it's been a few weeks since I finished it. But I'll see you down in the comments. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe as always. Take care, and I will see you soon. Bye.